Southern literature is alive and well, full of hope and possibility. Today, we're with New York Times best-selling author Patti Callahan Henry, who will lift the veil on the appeal of these tales. Thanks so much for being here today.
JT, thank you for having me. I'm honored. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate it. Let's just jump right in.
Of course.
What is it about the South that lends itself to such rich, complex stories?
You know, what's fascinating to me is that I come to Southern stories as an outsider. So when I'm called this fresh voice in Southern fiction, I always have to kind of smile behind the camera because I grew up in Philadelphia. So I come to Southern stories as an outsider. And so when I write them, I'm looking at it in a different way than those of us who have written it from the inside. And so I get to look at the family traditions and the history and the melancholy and the mystery as an outsider. So when I'm writing about it and I'm delving into it, I'm almost looking at it through an observer's eye while I'm learning about it. And although I've been here 30 years, and although I've, completely immersed myself in the South, I still have a wee bit of an outsider's eye, and I get to look at it a little more objectively while I dive into the deep end of it.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So tell me about the idea of love.
The idea of love was spawned by a thought I had on book tour. The idea of love is my 11th novel, and while I was out on the road, or whenever I'm on the road, people often tell me their stories. And I joke around and say that there are only a few people that people love to tell their secret stories to. Not their public stories, but their secret stories. And those are bartenders.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Right? And hairdressers.
And hairdressers.
And novelists.
Right.
So I really hear the best stories in the world. And often people say to me, will you write that story? And I always say, I don't want to steal your story. I'm not going to steal your story. So I started to wonder why I kept saying that and what does that even mean? So I decided to write about a character who stole a story. And meanwhile, while I was thinking about this character that might steal a story, I was reading an essay by Nora Ephron about her flops in her life, which stunned me because who would think she'd ever had a flop?
She'd ever had a flop. She's so prolific and so wonderful.
I mean, she was a screenwriter, a novelist. She wrote When Harry Met Sally. But just like the rest of the world, she's had flops, whether that meant a relationship or a play. And so I decided to write about a screenwriter who had had some flops and needed to steal a story. And that's where the idea came from, the idea of love.
Yeah, Blake Hunter. I really liked his character. It was very fun. The research that you did for that book, yes. The research that you do for all your books, but for that one in particular, what all did you do to learn about screenwriting?
Screenwriting fascinates me, as I'm sure it does you.
Sure.
Because it's
not something I can do.
Right, but it's another form of writing. And you and I are always trying to find different ways to express ourselves with the written word. And I think I've tried everything except poetry. And I tried that probably when I was 12. And no one will ever see it.
No one will.
It's in that box to be burned, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm fascinated with the way screenwriters use storytelling. You and I both use a lot of description and a lot of narrative arc with the description undergirding it.
Sure.
Well, screenwriting, you don't do any of that.
No.
It's pure dialogue, pure story momentum. So I interviewed a lot of screenwriters, and I tried to write a screenplay. I did write a screenplay, not that anybody will ever see it.
Why not?
I don't know. It's. You remember that first novel you wrote?
Yeah.
Has it been published? Has anybody seen it?
It's coming out in October, actually.
The first one you ever wrote is coming out this October?
Yeah.
That is thrilling.
I went back and rewrote it because it was so incredibly bad.
Well, that's my point.
But 10 years later, you can lend yourself to that.
Well, I did that with my first novel. Right. My first novel was my fourth, but I rewrote it.
Oh.
So same thing.
Awesome.
Yeah, I
Instant
went back
content.
Yeah. So anyway, I spent a lot of time really delving into the world of screenwriting and feeling it out. And so I hope that came through in the character's narrative arc. And it was fun to write about a writer who was desperate for a story, but a writer completely different than what we do.
Right.
And how he believed that the answer was on the outside, because we both know that creatively the answer is on the inside.
Sure.
And he believed that he could find a story to save his career and therefore save his life. And of course, he learned some lessons along the way.
He learned quite a few lessons.
Yes.
So give me one word to describe your books.
Oh, wow. One word to describe my books. Crossroads.
Crossroads.
Nobody has ever asked me that. Crossroads. recently I was asked if there was a theme that tied all my books together, and it took me a long time to think of that. And when I finally came up with it, it was the power of story. But all of my books, the character hits a crossroad and has to decide whether to turn left or turn right. They're going about their life, doing what they do, saying what they say, believing what they believe, thinking what they think, and then something happens, something out of their control. And then they have to make choices. And in making choices, they have to look at the past, and they have to look at their goals for the future, and they have to look how that they came to where they are.
Right.
And I think every single one of them has had that crossroads in it.
That's awesome. I've seen you talk before. I've seen you do a story about telling lies versus telling stories, and how in the South. Can you tell that story for us today?
That was a fascinating thing that happened in the idea of love that's happened in my other novels. That
It does.
Yes, and you know that sometimes we write things without knowing we're writing them.
Sure.
And that's part of the magic of telling a story, is that we believe we're telling a certain kind of story and a new theme emerges. And the theme that emerged again in the idea of love was this idea that we are in control of how we narrate our life. And that if we can narrate our life in a little bit different way, maybe we can change our life. And if we can narrate what's going on with us and how we feel about it, not only to ourselves, but to the people we're talking to, maybe we can change our life, and for the better. But we can also use it for bad. So I believe in the power of story, and I don't just mean the power of story that you and I believe in what we read. I believe in the power of myth, and the power of stories to change our opinions and our life, and to reflect back to us what we're already feeling.
Sure.
And how we can read a book, when we're 12, and then read it again when we're 40, and it's a new book.
It's a completely different experience. We get something totally new out of it.
Exactly. And so books are alive, and they change our lives, and they change through time, even though they themselves haven't changed. So the power of story has showed up in all of my novels in that way.
And there's something else that shows up a little bit.
Okay.
Lies.
Yes.
So in the idea of love, your characters are not only just lying to each other, they're lying to themselves.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Both of them are doing what they think they need to do to get through what they're going through. And both of them believe that all the bad things that are happening to them are coming from somewhere else, and that they just need to get around it. They just need to get around it. What they haven't learned is that you can't get through anything unless you go straight through it. So that's what they have to learn. But what's fascinating, and I do not advocate telling lies. That's
I was wondering.
I know, I do not advocate. My kids will see this. No, I do not advocate telling lies. But what was interesting was as they did, they started to see the truth. Because it was so obvious what they were doing at the tail end of it. And so they had to right what was wrong, but they could only do that by looking at the truth of it. So what they were trying to do in talking to each other, and they were lying because they were strangers. It was safe to lie to this stranger.
Sure, nobody's going to know the difference.
Nobody's going to know, and they can't find out. And neither one of them really looked at it as lying, but just finally having some fun and finding a way to moderate what was going on in their life. But as they got deeper and deeper. And they did what a lot of us do with anything, which is just one more.
Just one more.
Just one more.
Just, that's going to fix everything.
Yep, just one more.
Naming characters gives them great power.
Yes.
And obviously, as we're talking about, one of your characters is deceiving, and he has 2 names.
Yes.
So where do you come up with your names? And have you ever gotten through a story and realized, oh no, I've got the wrong name for this character?
I believe that names have power. I used to tell my kids when they were growing up, words have power, but names have power too. And I've always looked up the meaning of the names of my characters. And I've always chosen names that I thought sounded interesting. I'm a big name borrower. I just texted my sister-in-law yesterday and asked her to send me all the names of her nieces and nephews, because she's from Birmingham, Alabama, and her nieces and nephews have the most interesting names. Busy is one of them.
Busy.
B-I-Z-Z-Y. Because I'm
Southern.
I know. So I'm always trying to find interesting names. And if a name isn't fitting as I go along, I will change it, and I have changed it. I can't do that with my kids, obviously.
No, the pressure of a name.
Yes.
It's...
Well, and in my book, Coming Up for Air, I address the burden of ancestral names. And because her name is Lillian, and she's the first daughter of a first daughter of a first daughter.
Oh,
and I address the ancestral burden of naming. And I always look up the names. For example, Ella, in the idea of love, her name means goddess. And so I needed her to come into that, to stop looking at herself as a victim and come into who she really was.
Right.
So I do. I believe names are powerful, and I think they resonate in a certain way to a reader, and I want to make sure that that's as real and true as a setting or a character or the narrative.
You have a talent, I think, for finding the parts of people that others overlook. I think you do that in real life, and you really do it in your work. As the byplay between Blake and Ella unfolds and the details of their individual lives emerge, those small moments, the small details that you put in really define them. And how do you take the minutia and turn it into story gold?
That is such a great question, and I often say that I now get paid for what I used to get in trouble for. So when I was little, my parents would always say, "Get your head out of the clouds, stop, join us here on earth." But I was noticing everything. I drive my daughter crazy. We'll be walking through a city, and I'll point out everything: a fallen tree, something that happened, something that somebody said, what somebody's wearing, and it's this way of living in the world where I'm noticing all these little things. And of course that can be distracting and make one appear airheaded because they're thinking about other things than what's going on. But that's where the gist of life is. That's where the good stuff is. Generalization doesn't do us any good. What do they say? That the general is in the particular. So when we're starting to notice the particulars, the way somebody holds themselves, the way their nose itches when they're nervous, the way they smile or hold themselves, we're noticing who they are. And so so thank you for noticing that, because I try very hard to make that part of the work as well as part of life.
Oh, you do, and the details. I mean, I'm sitting in the kitchen as I'm reading the book, and I'm literally in the kitchen, and I'm seeing everything around it. And that's why it's so much like a screenplay, because the direction and the set pieces and everything, the book would make a fabulous movie. I could see it unfolding. Maybe
from your mouth to God's ear, or Hollywood's ear.
Maybe you should redo that screenplay and get that submitted.
Or just turn this one in.
Just turn that one in. Yeah. So the story within the story, obviously, with the screenwriting and the structure, there's a lot of Hollywood details and everything. Do you structure your writing? Are you a free-form kind of girl? Do you just jump in there and go for it, or do you outline and make sure everything has a path?
I want to be an outliner.
Don't we all?
I do. I want to be an outliner so badly. I want to have my closet organized by color. I want to file my kids' pictures by year, but I don't do any of those things. What I do is I come up with something that I'm interested in. For example, my last book, The Stories We Tell, was about letterpress. And I knew that the main character would run a letterpress before I knew what the book was even about. Mm-hmm. So I can't outline that. I have to explore it. I have to sit down with the character and say, what is letterpress? It's an image. It's an image of, that takes fine tuning. It's an image of holding things in your hand. It's a handmade life. And the more I explored that, the more I knew what the story was going to be about. So I can't get that with an outline. I have to explore it. But after I finish a rough draft, I do outline it, because I do believe in the hero's journey.
Okay.
And I believe that as humans, we resonate with story on certain, as Joseph Campbell teaches us, on a certain level, we resonate with certain points along a storyline, because innately, that is how we communicate, and that is how we understand life, is through the storyline.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I am done writing this story, I do try to go back and make sure that I have hit some of those major plot points and that the story arc itself makes sense. So I outline after I've done the messy work.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah. What is your process? What's your day like?
Oh, I have 3 wild kids, a wild family, so I wish I had more of an actual schedule, but I can say that I have to write before noon, the creative writing part. I can do the business, I can do everything in the afternoons, but the creative writing has to be done in the morning. And I try, it doesn't always work, but I try to get up very early and do the writing then. So.
That's incredible. The characters in the stories we tell, you have a letterpress artist, and in The Idea of Love, Ella is a wedding dress designer. I noticed that you have a lot of artists as your characters. Oh. So tell us about that.
You know, you just picked up on something I haven't given a lot of thought to. And one of my other ones, she's a photographer. So yes, you're right. Wow. And I think that's because it's rich material.
Sure it is.
You know, if you're an artist and you're working in an artistic field, and even if you're not, but especially if you are, you have to plumb your inner depths to get work that's worthwhile. And so these characters have to be willing to look at the rougher things in their life or the harder things in their life to be able to move on. And being artists, it allows them to do that. And a couple of my characters, they had a different career, and as they headed into the arts or opened themselves up to the arts, their life changed.
Did you always want to be an author?
I did, but I didn't know it.
Okay.
So when I was growing up, nobody said, you know, writing was a thing you could do. Nobody ever said in the late 70s, writing is a career, it's a thing in the world. Like, this is something you can do.
Right.
They asked me if I wanted to be a teacher or a nurse. And I was a nurse. That's what I went to school for. But to me, authors were people on book flaps, or frankly, dead. And so
and many of them were.
And many of them were. And so to me, the book was the living thing. The authors weren't. The book was the living thing. And I didn't give a lot of thought to the power or the person behind the book until college. And I was in nursing school, and I was a nurse, and I have my master's degree in nursing. So I did not start writing novels till later in life.
If you weren't, obviously with the creative arts, if there was something else, what else would you do?
It's so hard for me to answer that because I've thought about that before. If I had to stop writing.
Sure, if you had to stop writing, what would you do?
What would I do?
Where would you channel all of that energy?
I don't know. I would write anyway. I would write anyway.
Yeah.
It would be the thing I would do even if I couldn't do it. Now I have a lot of other creative hobbies I love. I love house designing and decorating and, you know,
which you
like
can
that.
put in the books.
Which I do put in the books.
You really get to explore everything you're doing at the same time.
Well, you mentioned how you noticed that I'm described the surroundings a lot in a home, and I do that because I'm very fascinated by it. So I don't know, I guess the answer is maybe I would try house decorating, but I can't imagine not using the power of story and words to form a creative life.
No, that's great. How did you get into publishing?
When I first started writing, I did not know a single person in the publishing world. I did not know one writer. I did not know a journalist. I didn't know a magazine editor. I didn't know one person in the writing world. And I made a decision, and it was a very before and after moment in my life. And I just went straight to what I've always done my whole life because I was a nurse. I went straight to research. I went straight to the library. And this was before you could really start Googling what to do. And I started reading about fiction writing and novel writing, and I had published a thesis, so I knew about writing, but not writing fiction. So I jumped in the deep end, and I started going to conferences and classes and workshops and meeting people and asking questions. And every time there was a speaker that came in town, I lived in Atlanta at the time, I would go hear them speak. I went to workshops, some of them great, some of them not so great. And I dove in the deep end and took the same amount of time one would take to get a graduate degree to learn what I was doing. And then the entire time I was writing my first novel. So I didn't just say I'm going to research it but not do it. I did both at the same time. And then eventually I had a finished novel and entered it in a contest, and then started entering that world of trying to find an agent and publishers. So.
And lucked out pretty quick, right?
Quick being relative.
Quick being relative.
Yes.
Overnight success.
Because
10 years later.
Exactly. Because my first book did get me an agent, but my first book didn't sell. I had to write another one. And as a first-time novelist, you finish that first book. And I didn't set out to write 11 books. I set out to write a novel, a story. And when I was done, and they said, you have to write another one, I was scared to death. And I thought, if I'm a writer, I have to write the second one. And it was actually the second one that sold first.
That's fabulous. So tell us, what's next for you?
what's next? I'm starting a new novel. So, and then I found you just came out. I just got off the road about 2 weeks ago, and I've just sat down on the desk and started pounding out another story. And once again, I'm just exploring it. I'm exploring a character who's trying to go back and buy her ancestral home. And what does that mean, and why is she doing it?
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for being here today, Patti.
It was an honor. Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
And thank you for joining us on A Word on Words. I'm JT Ellison. Keep reading.